Welcome to Language Access Matters, the podcast that dives deep into the crucial role of language access in public services and businesses. I am your host, Carol Velandia, and I invite you to join me on a journey of discovery and empowerment. Language access is not just a matter of convenience. It is a fundamental human right and the key that unlocks doors to essential services and opportunities. In this podcast, we'll explore the far-reaching impact of language access, examining how it shapes not only healthcare, justice, and education, but also the world of business. Through thought-provoking interviews, insightful discussions, and compelling stories, we will unveil the power of language access. We will hear from professionals who bridge communication gaps to provide quality care for diverse communities. We will explore the intersection of language, law, and justice, and the crucial role that interpreters and translators play in ensuring fair and equitable treatment. We will delve into the challenges and innovations as well as how language access opens doors to effective communication and inclusion, and how it makes our society more equitable. But our exploration doesn't stop there. We will also uncover the profound impact of language access in the world of business. We will hear from entrepreneurs, industry leaders, and experts who understand the value of inclusive and effective communication and how it drives success in today's global marketplace. Language Access Matters is your platform to understand the significance of language access in these vital sectors of society. We will shed light on the barriers faced by individuals and communities and the innovative solutions that promote inclusion and equality. Whether you are a healthcare professional, a legal expert, an educator, a business owner, a linguist, an advocate, or simply passionate about the power of language, this podcast is for you. Together, we will navigate the challenges, celebrate the victories, and advocate for a world where language access truly matters. So, join me on this enlightening journey as we uncover the impact of language access in healthcare, justice, education, and businesses. Let's amplify the voices of the 25 million people that don't speak English in the United States and those that don't speak the dominant language around the world. Those voices deserve to be heard and empowered, and we need to empower ourselves to build a more inclusive future. Welcome to Language Access Matters. Let's embark on this transformative exploration together. Hello, everybody. Today we're joined by Dr. Lorella Viola, Assistant Professor in Digital Humanities and Society at Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. Her research explores how language, culture, and power intersect in our digital age, from how translation and dubbing shape language itself to how multilingualism is represented and sometimes erased in digital spaces. Her work brings together technology, media, and cultural heritage to examine how people across Europe access knowledge in their own languages and what that means for inclusion, identity, and equity. Dr. Viola develops innovative digital humanities approaches to understand how digital transformation affects the way knowledge is created and shared, and how multilingualism can challenge the dominance of English and other monolingual systems, helping to build more inclusive, equitable ways of knowing. She is the author of The Humanities in the Digital, Beyond Critical Digital Humanities and Multilingual Digital Humanities. Through her work, she offers a fascinating bridge between the European and US experiences with language access, showing how linguistic diversity and digital culture together shape the future of inclusion. Welcome, Dr. Viola. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure as well, and thank you for the wonderful introduction. Well, ever since I heard about your work from our common friend, I said, oh my God, this is a perfect opportunity to help people expand the idea of language access into how it would look like in other countries. Because for the past 2 years in my podcast, I have talked a lot about language access within the US context. So I am looking for a different outside perspective that could help us in the US as well and could help us expand our horizons. So let's start with the journey that brought you here. Why don't you tell us about your study, language and culture and technology, how that became about?
Yeah, well, it was quite a journey. So I was always fascinated by languages. And I think I was about 9 when I was such a huge Michael Jackson fan. And I had this book that my sister gave me that apparently he wrote. He probably didn't, but it was marketed as he had. And of course, all his lyrics. So I really wanted to know what the meaning, the messages of these lyrics. So I was only 9, and I started to translate those lyrics. And when I grew up, I brought with me this passion for languages, this how they become carriers of a culture, but also how they become carriers of power. And it is really through this shift that I went into my university studies. I studied first translation and cultural mediation. And then through my PhD in language and communication studies, I also joined the technological shift that happened more or less when I started my PhD. And I really became very hooked, let's say, in how all these three components, language, culture, and technology, let's say, compensate but also antagonize themselves in a way. So particularly in how power also creeps in all these let's say features, so language, culture, but also technology.
Yes. And did you find or did you come across the concept of language access in your field, and how would you define it within the field of digital humanities and society?
Yes. So in a very banal way, of course, language access means the actual practical capacity to be able to access, to create, to find, to participate in the knowledge production space. However, we need to go beyond that. So for me, the thing that gets really at the core of the issue is not so much something that you tackle at the end of the process. Let's say you build an infrastructure in one language, in one dominant language, typically English, and then in the end you translate the interface, so you translate the content. That's really what real language access works. So for me, language access means thinking about the multilingual design right from the start. So it's something that happens at the infrastructure level. It's a commitment that happens much before you even start building anything. And that's how language access then becomes really a justice question. You decide right from the start who gets to be visible and who doesn't.
Right. And that's something I really found fascinating because in my university, I have participated as a student and also as an academic at the University of Maryland. And I realized that the concept of language access as a production of knowledge is really not conceived, at least not in my university. Language access in the US is at the moment tied to how people that don't speak English access public services, for example. And this is how I have been promoting it for a long time. So there are there are obviously differences between that approach that I think is so important, how the production of knowledge gets sort of imposed in one language, if you will, and who gets heard or visible through that work. So I found that fascinating, and I think is very different from what we are used to in the US. So when we look at Europe today, what are some, and I don't mean to generalize, right? It might be just particular to a country or even a university. But if we were to talk about Europe, what are some of the main language barriers that still persist despite the US strong multilingual ideals?
Yes, so it's true that in Europe, of course, multilingualism is on paper very high on the agenda, but it is true that it has been implemented in let's say more than perhaps other contexts have done in the world. However, despite all progress, still, in my opinion, big barriers persist. So first one is still the technological predominance of English. So if you just think about the programming languages, they are built in English and for English programmers. The syntax of how Python, for example, works and how you query the programming language happens in English. And of course, this huge, let's say, already bias in a way persists and determines how everything that is coded in that particular language is realized, that takes place. So the other thing is that let's say in Europe, as opposed to in the US, where it is framed more as a civil rights issue, in Europe, multilingualism becomes very much entangled with ideas of culture and the idea of heritage, for example. So on the one hand, this means very good for research. Typically, if you propose to be a research project and you ask for funding in something that is not mainly in English, you would probably get it in a way. However, at the same time, the risk is huge to still advance and prefer those 5 to 7 top European languages that get the biggest share of the pie, so to speak. So in other way, yes, good progress. On the other, this brings other issues. So, for example, replicating older selection biases. So whatever was considered worth preserving in the past gets priority in what we will digitize today.
Okay. I found that, well, I have lived in Spain kind of on and off for the past 3 years. And I've also spoken about language access at different conferences. And I remember in one of the conferences about 3 years ago, somebody in the audience said, I was talking about how language access was an issue and how language services providers needed to pay attention to this. And I just remember someone familiar with the Europe market stood up and say, we don't have that problem in Europe, basically, because everything is shared. Everything is translated into, I think it's 22 or 23, the languages of the UN. Yes. And then I go to Europe and I experienced it for myself that language access was really not a concept tied to public services. Like I did go to the doctor and I asked, well, of course I speak Spanish and I will not need an interpreter, but I asked how did the interpretation services work at that particular hospital. And it was such a roundabout way to get to an interpreter. Like it was not an immediate kind of thing. And just started to attend other types of conferences, talk to entrepreneurs about language access. And really, I didn't find the concept was predominant. So I did find the distinction between what language accessibility means for public services, for example, and what it means to translate into different languages because you have a mandate from the UN, like, or a mandate for your country to translate documents, right? It's not exactly the same, I thought. So, yeah, so I think that there is still, and I, of course, I'm only talking about my very brief experience in Spain with this as a Spanish speaker. So I can't, yeah so.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to follow up on that and say that it is, you're absolutely right. And like I said, at the policy level, and even the European Union Charter guarantees respect for linguistic diversity within the Union. And indeed, European citizens can communicate with European institutions in any of the official languages. So this is guaranteed as a right. And these are very strong statements of principle, of course. So these are very powerful statements. However, when you look at day-to-day life, so how do citizens meet with the state, right? How do you apply for a residence online? How do you fill a tax form? How do you access healthcare information? So these, unfortunately, still default to English, really let's say showing this huge gap. So they're either in the language of the nation, of the country where you need to apply for tax residency and so on. But if you do want another service in another language, then the alternative is English. It's very rare that you find any other alternative, and this perhaps, with very few exceptions of bilingual countries. I'm thinking of the Belgium, for example, where there is a Flemish and French. But if you don't speak either, for example, you are, I happen to speak both, but let's say somebody from Spain who doesn't necessarily have these the language skills in either of these languages, then they would default immediately to English. So on paper, yes, but just at the very, very high level, policy level, when you talk to each individual country, the situation looks much more different.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's in that sense, we are a bit similar with the US because we have really good laws, right? We have Title VI, and now we have for healthcare Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act. And we used to have Executive Order 13166. Now that has been revoked. But my point is that we have really strong laws or norms in paper, but at the point of usage, nobody knows about them. And in that we're similar. So do you see, so talk a little bit more, if you can talk about more about the differences in how the governments in Europe understand language rights versus language services with public services. So it seems like so why don't you tell the audience a little more about all of this infrastructure that is supposed to be in place from the policy level?
Yes. I think in Europe, especially, many institutions really pride themselves on multilingualism, don't they? So they really talk about the value of multilingualism, and in principle, I'm sure they do believe in these values. However, when you look at, let's say, the digital, for example, realization of those public profiles, for example, then again, we have the problem of prioritizing just one language. And typically that is English, if not just the state, let's say the actual country language. So let's say at the level of the architectures, this means that English silently decides who can participate comfortably in these spaces and whose knowledge gets to be represented and accessed. So obviously this filter happens very, very early on, right? So, and it determines, for example, how you present the research results, in which language you present them, what kind of data are the best to be used in which language, or for instance, which work gets to be cited more, and typically that is in English, obviously, because academia, particularly, and research is, let's say, a very, in the end, monolingual, Anglo-centric environment. So this has, so starting from the level of the infrastructure in reality, this then becomes in a way, so it cripples in many consequences. For example, what you really mean when you mean you are multilingual. Do you just mean that you create everything in one language and then in the end you translate it, or do you actually let's say the equity happens at the design of these systems? So like I said earlier, like the translation is one way to do it, but the actual paradigm shift needs to happen at the cognitive and emotional, let's say, the right level. So you need, that's what we advocate for, not so much, oh, we need more translations, which seems to be happening at the, let's say, at the European infrastructural level. Oh, we just put everything in many languages. We just hire as many translators as we can. Yes, but at the infrastructure level, what is the dominant language really? And that's what we are really trying to, let's say, advocate for. I am trying to advocate for that much deeper paradigm shift.
Yes, okay, which is kind of like a very different perspective what we are accustomed to. So, because I think that's a great point. What really is multilingualism, right? And I think in that understanding, Europe perhaps excels and is perhaps way ahead of the United States when it comes to inclusion of other languages. And perhaps in the US, we can say, okay, maybe we understand a lot about, or some about getting people from different languages to understand what we're saying in English, right? Because I think that the US, or as you know, the US is one of the most multilingual countries in the world, yet we have narrowed ourselves to one official language as of recently. And Europe doesn't really have that problem, which is, in my opinion, wonderful, because then it allows for more inclusion and equity, especially in the world of migration and waves of people coming into Europe. So how does Europe, well, of course, we're not going to talk about migration specifically, but Europe continues to experience these waves of migrants. How do the language policies adapt or fail to adapt to these diverse linguistic landscapes?
Yes. Again, on paper, we have very strong, let's say, policies and guidelines for that. However, again, in reality, I have to say, policies in Europe are catching up much more slowly than the actual demographics, let's say, happens in reality. Let's say so digitally, which is the space that I mostly work with. This adaptation has meant so far moving in a way that it includes all the European languages. However, migration in Europe doesn't just come or happen from other European countries, of course, but the actual shift would be to move beyond EU official languages translation to include migrant and low resource languages. But this doesn't just concern, for example, policies or how services are accessed, but I'm also thinking like a less, let's say, post-colonial way, and let's say think about how these low resource languages can in fact, finally be represented also in the archives, in the interfaces, in how we build our models, in the way we preserve data, in the way we circulate data, in the way we make information accessible nowadays.
Right.
Sorry.
No. I was gonna. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just wanted to ask if all these offerings are more aimed to assimilating the official languages of Europe rather than what I'm understanding is that they are more oriented at helping people assimilate to the already established languages in Europe than helping people bridge that gap between their language, let's say a low resource language, into a particular service. Is that correct? What I'm understanding here?
So I would say the way we are, so Europe is dealing with the issue, let's say, is still trying to, let's say, make these, the people that come from a language cultural background that doesn't come from one of the EU official languages or cultures, then, to sort of how do they make their living? So in a very practical way, right? How do you, again, apply for that particular service
Exactly.
or that particular, I don't know, license or certificate? But when it comes to the real representation, that doesn't really happen at any level that I am aware of, and if it does, it's really just niches and I don't know, little clusters here and there that are scattered around the personal initiatives or this NGO or that particular research group. But what I'm really thinking about is, and I'm really talking about, is where representation of voices really happens. How represented and visible are you in Europe as a person coming from your cultural and language background? So my work on historical migrations of Italian migrants in the US, which I carried out studying language newspapers written by Italian migrants in the US at the turn of the 20th century, has in fact showed that language doesn't just mean, let's say, access to that particular service. Of course, it does. But also through language, we actually sustain our identities. That's how we negotiate who we are. That's how we negotiate inclusion or exclusion. And migrants and their voices can, in fact, transform host societies. And this is happening anyhow, right? In the environment, when you walk around your cities, we are transforming the way cities look like anyhow. But when this becomes, let's say, more into just opening that shop or, I don't know, building that particular neighborhood, how do we manage to make the shift and listen to these voices in a way that could actually participate actively in the knowledge production and access space? That's the real, I think, missed opportunity that digital policies are still really not quite getting there yet.
Yes, that's fascinating. I was thinking about examples, or maybe you can help me with examples of how that language gets or transform our realities and our identities. If I read correctly about your book, or why don't you tell us about your book and what it aimed to discover or express?
Yes, so in the book that I wrote, The Humanities in the Digital, I really talk about how knowledge creation in the digital needs to be really mindful of how methods are really subject and susceptible to power and context. And like I said earlier, it's really unpredictable how consequences in the digital space unfold because of the ramifications that happen at the infrastructure level of how the digital works. And I'm thinking about social networks, but also, of course, the internet itself. You don't really know. You cannot, in fact, predict the reach out and the impact, the ripple effect of whatever you design or put or shape or, let's say, share in the digital space. Precisely because of this, the creation of knowledge today needs to be extremely careful of how we produce knowledge today. And if we do not have these power dynamics in mind at all times, but in fact, even before we even think about creating and designing our object or I don't know, paper or even podcast, for example, then the risk is that let's say, we keep perpetuating biases and imposing our views, and this can be ideological, this can be, of course, cultural, there are many different ways that we can impose our views into the way knowledge is constructed today. And something that I always say, and I talk about in the book, is how do we want our, let's say, the people that will access knowledge tomorrow, looking back at us, how do we want this knowledge be accessed and seen in the future? How do we train? How do we want our next generation of students to be trained? What kind of values we want to pass on to the digital society of tomorrow? These are questions that we need to address today, not in a future that will come about at some point. We are living in the future already, so this happens to this has to happen now, and this is what I really advocate in the book through very specific examples. Let's say of projects that I have curated, and how this conscious image of biases and power can be embedded right at any stage of the research workflow. Yes. Whereas in the other book, Multilingual Digital Humanities, we curated 13 case studies of from Arabic to Tamil and many other languages, or how multilingualism gets operationalized at the infrastructure, pedagogical, and language technology level. So it's also interesting.
What does that mean, to be multilingualism being operationalized at that level?
Yes,
Could you
exactly
expand?
Absolutely. So there are examples of the research initiatives that have tried to embed multilingualism right at the start of the workflow. Again, not just at the end as, we provide the translation as the end product, but everything becomes, let's say, right from the start, thought and created in that particular language. And there are examples that are quite famous. For example, like the programming historian. This is an educational set, like a toolkit that happens online, that provides educational pedagogical content for digital humanists, already created in different languages. So the lesson is created in that particular language and with the thought in mind of that particular audience, and it's not created in English and then translated. So if you want the lesson exists in Spanish, for example. And this is just one example of how we can really move beyond the paradigm shift of, let's just translate. And again, I'm not against translation. I don't want this to be the message that passes on, of course. I'm still an advocate for that. But let's not just, let's say, mistake or confuse translation as now we are multilingual, because those are different levels of engagement.
How interesting. And I think we need to pay more attention to that, because it's definitely a thought that really hadn't crossed my mind. I think many people many people confuse those two things, and they don't mean the same thing. Now, how translation can modify? Can translation even modify the way you look at things? Is what I'm getting from here. And I was just thinking about how, for example, the language has changed throughout the years because of the influence of English. So in my country, for example, I am originally from Colombia, and I go every year at least. And I've noticed, I've been living in the US for the past 20 years, and I've noticed that in Colombia, the vocabulary and how words are used nowadays in the news or even in the soap operas has a clear influence. I can perceive it from the English language. I don't know if that had to do with translation at some point of the process, or what happened into that. So when I was reading about your book and your books and your research, I was like, I wonder if she's talking about this as well, like how the way we interact and we use our language has been modified by the influence of English, because original things came in English, and now we think, and somebody translated it in X way, and that is the way now we are using the expression, for example.
Yeah, so thank you so much for the question. And my PhD thesis was actually on the influence of American films on spoken Italian language. So I was really picking up on what you just described. So because in Italy we dub everything. So in Italian film, so in the cinema you get either the Italian productions, or of course they come already originally from Italian actors, so everything is in Italian. But we also, the majority of what we get in the cinema still is predominantly from Hollywood, right? So American productions, Northern American productions, and those products are not, let's say, offered to the Italian audience in the original language with Italian subtitles, but they become dubbed. So we have, which is even more than just a voiceover, right? So professional actors give their voices to American actors, and everything gets translated at the back, and then they really act on the actual film. So for us, for example, Al Pacino has one specific voice, because then they pick always the same actors. And I remember when I first watched my first, American film in the actual original, I was shocked to hear the actual Al Pacino voice. For me, it was a shock. Oh my God, it doesn't sound like Al Pacino at all. Then I decided to investigate how I was wondering whether that in fact introduced biases in the way we speak in Italy today. And it turned out that it does, because translators had many constraints, and still do, not just to carry on the message of the film and the actual line of each actor, but they also have to match the lip sync. Mm-hmm. So because of this, many things were like forced into expressions that could, in a way, also match the lip sync, while at the same time convey more or less the same message. And this came out very odd at some point. Sometimes they did amazing work, but other times, unfortunately, they came up with these expressions that I demonstrated in my PhD that they did not used to exist in the Italian language before dubbing was introduced. 100 years ago. And through a series of examples, I demonstrated how actually that does influence how people speak today. And now we say things in Italian that, when you think about it, they don't really make any sense.
Right.
But we just say them knowing what we mean. And now I understand, and through my PhD thesis, I demonstrated the meaning. So why they don't make any sense? Because they don't. Because we don't really have that. Because we don't really have that particular, let's say, the concept behind it. Like the $1 million question. We don't have dollars. We never had dollars in Italy. We have the lira, but we have one expression that says, "Wow, this is a $1 million question." They translate that literally word for word. But when you think about it, why would we say that? We don't have dollars.
Exactly. And to look like $1 million is very different than to look like 1,000,000 pesos. I mean, like if we were to use the word.
Absolutely. Yes, indeed. Like even when we had the lira, 1 million lira was not that much money anyhow. So.
In Colombia, for example, we don't dub the movies. We listen to all of them in the original language. However, I've seen that our language is morphing, perhaps as a result of watching TV in English and trying to translate that into conversational Spanish, right? So, for example, I hear, or even social media influence. So now, for example, people talk about postear in Spanish, right? Instead of publicar, or right, or give me a like would be expressed as dame un like, right? Give me a like, or taguear. So it becomes a verb. Or another thing that I've noticed is that not only expressions, but actual words have disappeared or have acquired different meanings. So I love watching all soap operas all Colombian soap operas, and their Spanish sounded to me, after many years when they were broadcasted, the Spanish sounded to me like this is the real Spanish, right? Because they use the words I grew up with. So to give you an example, they would use the word banquete for or banquetes for catering. And now if you go to Bogota, nobody knows what a banquete or banqueteria is. Everybody calls it catering or catering. And it it is really interesting to me. And now um, to bring that example to the interpretation world, we face this pretty much all the time with patients that have heard the expression so many times in English that it became the normal word. So, for example, if I tell to a patient, if I interpret what the doctor is saying as you need to do an MRI, and I go into Spanish, señor, usted necesita tomarse una resonancia magnética o hacerse una resonancia magnética. He's going to look at me as if I had three eyes. And then I say, well, usted tiene que hacerse un MRI. And then they will go like, yeah, an MRI. And then the word became MRI. So I see all these shifts. And one of the, and the reason why that becomes an issue is because we as interpreters, for example, we don't know if accessibility might look like, let's just say the word they understand. For example, MRI or catering instead of the actual words. What does access look like? Because that has shifted from 20 years ago.
Yes, I have to say that this, of course, the language has always changed, right? It's part of the living languages because only things that are dead do not change, right? So right. For as long as we speak those languages, for as long as we have spoken those languages have always shifted. They've always changed, always reflected changes in society, in culture, in technological advancement, and so on and so forth. So this is totally normal. There is nothing to worry about, nothing to be threatened by. This is part of humans and the human languages. So that's totally okay. What it is interesting, however, to still study and relevant is not in a way that is confrontational or antagonistical, or we are trying to change anything or to stop it, because it's not gonna stop, right? It's just how languages are designed. It's, however, studying what are the mechanisms and how languages, in fact, change, because languages react differently, let's say, at different changes, and how the changes reflected in a language on the other way around, that tells you a lot about what is happening in the world that surrounds the speakers that speak that language. So this is really what is interesting from a linguistic point of view. Not so much that, now people speak differently, that's not the real Spanish, that's not the Italian Spanish. Of course it's the real Spanish. For as long as Spanish people speak it, it's real. There is no such a thing as language purity, language, let's say, something that is absolutely pristine.
Absolutely,
nothing
yes.
That is. So it's real because it's spoken, and speakers, let's say, dictate what is real, not a dictionary that was written 20 years ago. So just what I want this, because sometimes, unfortunately, these conversations about language changes can very rapidly shift into nationalistic discourses or language ideologies. And as a linguist, I know, and every linguist in the world knows, that that's not the case at all. And we need to try to advocate also against that. What I'm trying to say is that it's interesting to see what brought about that change. So why do we feel the need to incorporate those changes in our languages, and it doesn't happen the other way around, for example? And of course, research has shown that at the cognitive level, that happens because there is a dominant culture and there is a more submissive culture. And if you are the language that incorporates rather than giving, then this means that you feel the need to adopt things that do not originally had not originally belonged to your language, if you want to fit in. So that's what's really interesting. And that's, in fact, the other way around. So we start from there, and just we need to ask our questions. why do we need, is it okay to feel like we have to fit in a culture and a language that is not originally ours in order for us to fit in? How equitable is this? Is this real language access that everybody eventually converges through towards one dominant culture?
Exactly.
So that's the real question that we need to ask, and not like, oh, people don't speak real Italian anymore, because that's
right.
not
So
the
I think
language we
there
are
is
interested in.
no, but I think there is a very fine line between the two, I think, because, and I guess what you're saying is that it depends what is the question that goes behind. Whether you're talking about like, oh, this is real Spanish versus, where is it, from where are we having the idea that this is the way to say things so that we can fit in? Right. I think it's a very fine line that we need to understand, in order to
In order to ask the right questions.
yes,
If we
exactly.
don't ask the right questions, then we won't find the right answers either. And the actual, that's where actually, let's say, language access and equity happens, in a way that we finally understand that this, let's say, the actual inclusivity means that, I don't necessarily have to, let's say, fit in your pre-existing frameworks in order for me to be listened, in order for me to be visible, in order for me to be represented in the space. If I think about platforms such as Twitter, for example, that host officially hundreds of languages, recent research has shown that actually most of the debate converges into perhaps 5 to 10 dominant languages, of which English is the predominant one. Even in, let's say, sub networks where there are typically one specific language, Italian, English, French, Spanish, whatever, it doesn't matter. Still, non-English speakers post in English because that makes the post more visible and potentially can reach out to more people. So again, this is one way that we bend our own language skills into something that, let's say, doesn't really accommodate initially for other languages in order for us to be heard.
That's a great point, Dr. Viola. And now that you're talking about Twitter and technology, do you think technology will narrow or widen all of this, the language gaps, and how it will impact, for example, AI or any other technology, machine translation, digital literacy? What are the effects of this?
Yes. So is the technology narrowing or widening the gaps? Well, the short answer is both. So, for example, if I think about machine translation and multilingual natural language processing, absolutely, they can open doors. They can absolutely widening, let's say, the possibilities. So in a way, shortening the gap, but on one condition. So these need to be trained on as diverse as possible and as representative as possible data. And all these multilingual and multicultural steps need to be really embedded at any stage of the workflows, because without diverse and representative multilingual data, then the gaps will become even sharper, in the sense that these biases will keep privileging only a number of high-resourced European languages. So the actual, let's say, shift when technology becomes really helpful in this and not, in fact, harmful, is when you pair technological advances with critical digital literacy. And this happens also at the training level, not just at the training, like data training, but also training of the coders, the training of, the the programmers, the training of the people who make the decision, who gets the funding at the institutional level. So it's a lot of education that needs to happen still. And this is really critical digital literacy, not just, let's educate the citizens. We need to educate also who makes the decisions, who decides where funding is more allocated, because I can advocate for digitize and create more representative data in many languages, but unfortunately these processes are still very expensive, and not many countries can afford that. So for these, governments need to understand that it's not just let's include that particular language. It's really about how we create a better knowledge creation space for everyone, for our children, for politicians' children as well. So this is where the digital literacy education needs to happen, and I haven't really seen this happening just yet. Unfortunately, multilingualism somehow is not really high on the agendas because they're missing the actual point, the actual value of it. I think.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. Like, what message would you like policymakers and educators and advocates to take from your research? So you're reading into that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, basically, just to reiterate, we need more education happening on what is the real value of multilingualism. It's not just, it sounds so nice. It's really not just that. It has a very, very deep meaning that will affect how we are shaping the knowledge of the future. We need to start yesterday. We need it.
And it seems, Dr. Viola, from my conversation with you, that we have a lot of work to do from all different perspectives. I am now in the Arabian Peninsula, I'm in Qatar, and realize how much opportunity there is. I mean, specifically Qatar, for example, has 90% of the population is expats, right? And it's a very special kind of situation. So I'm like thinking, oh my God, there is a lot of work to do from my perspective about language access in the way I have conceived it, right? As a civil rights issue. And there is a lot of work from your perspective to do in the academic world, in the policy world, and in the advocacy world. So my last question, Dr. Viola, is how do you personally define this linguistic justice? What it would look like if we truly achieve language justice? Sort of like paint a picture of the future.
Yes. So when we need to understand this. So when people can read, can contribute, can create knowledge and access knowledge in their language, one of these consequences, these good consequences of that, is that you get better public health communication, you get better higher and better institutional trust, you get richer debate, you get more views. When something is filtered through just one language, then these vacuum spaces, let's say these spaces, empty spaces become, let's say, happen. They are realized, and that's exactly where disengagement or let's say fragmentation and of society creeps in. That's where a space for misunderstanding, mistrust, misinformation actually creeps in. So like I said earlier, it's not just because it sounds nice. It is nice to say a brochure level, we're so multilingual. No, really, this means democratic values. This means social cohesion. Societies are changing so rapidly. People move. Some societies, like you said yourself, have the majority of people are not from that country anyhow. So more, let's say, a better future, let's say, which should be this, our present, is really the possibility, the ability to participate culturally, civically, and scholarly in a language that it doesn't just approximate to English. So we shouldn't feel the need to really be as close to English as possible in order to be seen. What does it mean that in practice? In practice means that we can search, we can cite, we can find knowledge in languages, many languages, in many interfaces, as many as the users of those particular spaces are. And in a way, for example, this happens also at artificial intelligence level, which is, everybody's talking about that. A lot of people don't really know what they're talking about. I think a lot of people just mean ChatGPT when they think about AI. But when with the way we evaluate artificial intelligence systems nowadays is still, unfortunately, predominantly how their cross-lingual performance compares against English. So there is so much work to do still, and it is only possible if we rethink about how infrastructures need to be rewired, not just translated, but really rewired. And that's when this shift happens, I think the future will be eventually reachable.
I love that. Infrastructures need to be rewired. I love that, and I'm going to note it for myself. Thank you, Dr. Viola. So, as we've heard, language reflects power, culture, and belonging. Dr. Viola's research reminds us that even in multilingual regions like Europe, true access and participation depend on how we design our digital, cultural, and institutional systems. As she said, we need to rewire the infrastructure from the get-go. And in this digital age, creating those spaces where everyone can share knowledge in their own language, it's not only that technical challenge from what I heard, but it's also like a commitment to multilingual democratic values, if you will. And it's about recognizing that democracy thrives when every voice in every language can be heard and understood. That's a beautiful message. And Dr. Viola works by bridging Europe and the United States to create those bridges, showing that whether we're talking about healthcare access, education, or digital archives, language access is a foundational to equity, inclusion, and democracy itself. Thank you so much, Dr. Viola.
It was a pleasure for me to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
And that wraps up another enlightening episode of Language Access Matters. We hope you have enjoyed our discussion on the profound impact language access has across various sectors of society. Let's remember that language access is not just an isolated topic. It intertwines with various fields, impacting lives and businesses in profound ways. As we continue this journey together into becoming a more inclusive society where we ensure equal access to services to those who don't speak the dominant language, we want to assure you that our company, Equal Access Language Services, through its podcast Language Access Matters, will be with you every step of the way. We are committed to bringing you thought-provoking conversations, expert opinions, and stories from the field and beyond. To dive deep into the subject matter and engage with leading experts in the field, we will release a new episode of Language Access Matters once a month. By featuring expert practitioners and individuals with diverse experiences, we aim to broaden the scope of our discussions and present a comprehensive view of the importance of language access. We encourage you to stay connected with us through our website, www.equalaccesslanguageservices.com, and our social media platforms. You can join the conversation, ask questions, and share your own stories and experiences. If you want to be part of our podcast, email us to podcast@equalaccesslanguageservices.com. Remember, language access matters to each and every one of us. By understanding its significance and actively working towards its advancement, we can create a more inclusive and equitable society. Thank you for being a part of the Language Access Matters community. We appreciate your support and look forward to sharing more knowledge, inspiration, and empowerment with you in our future episodes.